All right, if you're out there in the lobby, come on in. Come on in. Well, thank y'all again for being here, not just here, but here at our first annual Redeemer Network conference. My name is Brandon Barker, and I'm the executive director for our network. Been doing it for a little bit over a year, and have just grown to love our people, our pastors, our teams, our churches. I just love what we get to do. And so today the plan was this. We wanted to have a panel discussion on conflict resolution in light of the gospel. And the reason that we did it as a panel rather than a breakout session is that we didn't want it to be optional for anyone. We wanted you to sit through it. And the reason for that will become clear as we make our way through the morning. And so here's what I'd love to do. I'm going to pray, and then I will introduce our panel, and we will work our way this way. We'll know why in a second. And then we'll dive into it. Sound good? Okay, that was not enthusiastic enough. Sound good? There we go. All right, let me pray, and we'll get to it. Father, thank you for this morning. Thank you for this conference. What a privilege it is. What a sweet gift of your grace to get to be called your sons and daughters. And then to get to serve your bride and to do that together. We are deeply grateful for that. I pray that our conversation today would be encouraging, fruitful, and another small deposit on the road to being healthy Christians, healthy leaders, leading with healthy teams so we have healthy churches. We pray in Christ's name. Amen. Amen, amen, amen. Well, let me introduce our panel right to left. Dusty Thompson. We've all met Dusty. Everybody knows and loves DT. Dusty, founder of Redeemer Lubbock, founder of the Redeemer Network, and chairman of our board.
I'll be Leanne's backup vocalist for this session right here. This is my main thing.
Yes, that is why we're starting on the far end. We did a pre-call before this, and it was clear, educated and sharp, brilliant and an expert. And so that is why we're working our way this way. We will stop in an hour, Leanne.
We're gonna have some conflict.
Is it not working?
Maybe.
Yeah, there we go.
Yes, we might have some conflict.
Okay.
No. Glad to be here.
David Miller. David Miller serves on our board. He has spearheaded the Catalyst work, the replanting, revitalizing ministry of the Redeemer Network. He's a professor at Texas Tech, serial entrepreneur, and earned a Juris Doctorate and an MBA at Texas Tech. Did I say that right? I had to look up what that was when you told me that you had one of those. And then Leanne, she is a communications professor turned HR and change management consultant. Your website describes you as endlessly curious about people, and that was very evident in our call. Okay, so here's what I would like to do. We want to talk about conflict management, and some practical skills on how to go about doing it. But I want to start like this. I want to start with simply defining terms. And so what is conflict? Dusty.
Conflict. I would say, I don't think that it's necessarily negative. Like even as we hear the term, you're immediately going to go to, oh man, I know about that. I'm trying to avoid that. But conflict is just when there's a couple different perspectives. I guess you could say that broadly. And it might be mild, that there's differing levels of intensity. But it's where we just disagree and see it differently, and it can spin out of control. There can be a lot of reasons we see things differently, but I would just start there. There's ranges of health and unhealth and intensity.
Leanne?
Yeah, I would just add to that I think an important distinction to be made between sort of the difference between a just disagreement and conflict, I think, is that conflict is more a perceived struggle of, or between at least two parties around, again, perceived or real kind of incompatibility, resources, goals, aspirations, identity. So I would echo what Dusty said, that conflict in and of itself is not necessarily a negative thing, but it really centers around this idea of what are perceived incompatibilities.
Yeah. So we'll certainly get to why conflict can be a good thing later. But let's start with this, kind of piggybacking on what you just said. What are some examples of things that we think of as conflict that really aren't, and what are things that we think of that are not conflict but really are?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's just such a breadth and depth of human behavior to sort of explore with this. I think firstly, we all have to sort of acknowledge that we come to the table with different ideas and opinions and even, biases around conflict. Some of us feel comfortable in conflict. We feel comfortable when we're sort of negotiating or competing with others or trying to really jockey for our idea or our position. Some of us would avoid conflict or perceived conflict at all costs, right? And so what a person perceives as conflict is really unique to them. And I think that's something that we have to remember anytime we're engaging with other human beings, is what I think is conflict, you may not think is conflict, and vice versa, right? But I do think that sometimes we, especially as believers, I think because we value or should value unity so much and relational peace and harmony, that sometimes we will assume or project more kind of negativity onto what is just a disagreement about a task or a process or a strategy or an idea, and we'll sort of project our own biases about conflict onto something that actually isn't. It's just a struggle for the best idea or the best strategy or process. So that is one thing I see, is that we tend to kind of put our own feelings about conflict onto situations that the other person may think, that was fun. I actually had a client who, her CEO, they were both like competing in nature. They got just a lot of joy out of like hashing it out together. And it was funny, she told me a story one time that she and the CEO were kind of in a conference room where there was a glass wall, and she said, we were kind of just going at it with each other. And when I came out, somebody said, did you just get fired? And she said, are you kidding? That was the most fun we've had in weeks, And so I think we do have to remember that. I think on the flip side, what do we not consider conflict? What comes to my mind immediately is what we call latent conflict, which is sort of the elephant in the room kind of conflict, where we're sort of just letting things go, we're kicking the can down the road. We think that we're accommodating or overlooking an offense, but really what we're doing is letting conflict brew to the point where it gets really rough, So that's what I would say to that.
David, anything you would add?
Absolutely not.
Well then, David, let's keep trying to define some terms. What is healthy conflict engagement?
Yeah, I guess for me, I'm going to go to the Bible for the answer. Is, when I look at like Romans 12, when it says, if possible, so much as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. That's, for me, more than a call to sit on the sidelines. So I read Scripture as meaning that we are the initiators of creating peace. And that certainly doesn't mean avoiding conflict, because I don't know how you become a peacemaker or even a peacekeeper, which I think is a lower standard if we're avoiding conflict. So for me, healthy conflict then is communication that leads to increased trust and improved relationships, so much as it depends on us. So I think that's like a really high standard for everyone, for all followers of Christ, but I think especially for people that are leading his bride through the power of the Spirit. And so unhealthy conflict would be, like Leanne said, like projecting or carrying my own baggage into the conversation and leading to more relational damage. To me, that would be really unhealthy. Just as much as then avoiding conflict, which would breed potentially resentment and a lack of trust.
Yeah. DT, Leanne, anything you would add to that?
No, I mean, I love that. I mean, I would just add even like there's like a gospel identity component because like one thing that David said that just sparked a thought was that, you bring your own baggage in it. And so like if you've got these insecurities, let's say, like you're not secure in who you are in Christ and like you go into that room, Leanne had mentioned like look, you may be debating the best idea. Like it's an idea, it's not about you. But then like someone comes into it and then their idea gets shot down or other idea gets picked and then now they're mad and they're either pouting or they're fighting or like you've got conflict in the room, but it was like it was really even a gospel identity issue of like, just there's some insecurities that were brought into it that made it not about the idea anymore,
Yeah.
It actually can bring conflict and you're like, how did that get here exactly? Yeah.
So getting to why we wanted this to be a session for everyone that no one could escape, it's because we assume this. Almost everyone in this room, or everyone in this room, has some scar in their life from poorly handled conflict, in particular if it's been inside the church. And so let me ask this. Why does it matter that we're talking about conflict with church leaders? This is for all three of you. Somebody jump.
I mean, I could just start on a relational level is that, I mean, I'd have to think back to the most painful things that have happened to Redeemer over the years and think if any of them weren't this, that no matter what the issue was, this is where it went. And where you end up having people that you were really close with that maybe helped you start the church, And those are sometimes some of the most painful ones where you've got these people you actually like really care about and now all of a sudden they're like real withdrawn and you haven't seen them several Sundays in a row and it's real icy and you could just like used to they'd want to stop in the hallway and talk or maybe they haven't been in weeks or where it turned into World War III and you're like what just happened here or you find yourself getting it's not just them but maybe you find yourself getting really reactive and you're man they just came up and asked a question about my sermon and I put them in their place and it was just actually a really fair question like well, my goodness and like realizing that maybe you were even the one that caused it and so I just think this is so relevant because of that almost every like no matter what the leadership decisions or the church direction or anything else like this was the stuff that like became very very hard to navigate I think as a leader and to know what like how do you make that right and how do you try to navigate it.
Anything? David Lee, anything to add?
Along the lines of what Dusty said, when I think back about pivotal and really important conversations, there was also, I guess in just about every case I can remember, there was some degree of conflict. And part of that was in my role of an elder and seeking to protect the flock in some ways. I find those to be some of the most difficult conversations, but I also find that if I'm prepared for it in prayer, I've seen God do just tremendous things. And I think in the church, it's one of the best ways that we can see the glory of God and the power of the gospel in real relationships. And you wouldn't think that could be a byproduct of healthy conflict, but I've seen it over and over again that the Spirit somehow, in ways that I don't fully understand, brings more unity when we're willing to address things and do so in a pattern of prayer and seeking the Spirit's presence in the conversation. So I just think healthy conflict is absolutely essential to a church that aspires to have unity under Christ.
That's good. Well, that kind of took us to our next question of, is conflict good or can it be good in a church? Yes, no?
Yeah, I'll speak to just even what I think the research shows about conflict in organizations. And one of the things that I'm very passionate about when I do get to serve churches is to help them understand you're a unique organization, but you're still an organization, right? And so all of the research and kind of the best practices as it relates to organizational development still apply to you, in the roles that you're in. And so what we know about conflict in organizations is, it depends. Like, is it good? Well, it depends. It depends on the type of conflict, on kind of the norms around conflict. But what's really fascinating is that when researchers look at the highest performing teams, what they find is that conflict is a norm in those teams. Now, again, what kind of conflict are we talking about is a different piece of that conversation. But what I mean by that is when there is trust, and I think that's sort of what both of you, are speaking to, when there's trust in a team or in an organization, right? There is a foundation for conflict to actually do really cool things because, Patrick Lencioni is an author and kind of speaker. He wrote the book, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. It's a fantastic read if you haven't had a chance to read that. And I won't get this quote verbatim, but he says, when there is trust, conflict is just the pursuit of truth, with people who really care about each other. So for me, when I look at the research around conflict, I see teams that are comfortable and have what we call psychological safety, where they feel free to say, hey, wait a minute, elder, wait a minute, pastor, I kind of disagree with that, or I kind of am concerned about this, when there's freedom to do that, when there's trust in the organization, or when a member feels that you're accessible enough to come say, hey, I was sort of bothered a little bit by this, and I know that may trigger, just a little bit, but when there's safety to do that, that conflict can actually lead to more innovation, more creativity, more perception of team cohesion, and more trust. So it can actually be a catalyst for all sorts of beautiful things, I think, that are a reflection of God's character and nature and his design for the church.
So on a personal note, when it comes to conflict, one of the ways that I have hurt people on teams that I've led is by not engaging conflict in healthy or timely ways. And I didn't most often because I bought a lie that the presence of conflict was a failure of leadership. What are some other misconceptions about conflict that church leaders in particular tend to believe?
Yeah, first off, I think that's, really cool to hear you share, because I think it's something that every leader, from in any context can relate to, that, you feel so exposed, and the state of your team or the state of your church in so many ways feels like a reflection, and it is in a lot of ways a reflection of your leadership. So I think that for me, even just a leading out in humility to say, this is some ways that I've failed in conflict is a beautiful thing. But I think what I see a lot is leaders who, and I work with a lot of organizations that are, they're corporate organizations, but they're led by believers, and they know that I'm a believer, and so we'll end up having conversations. And one thing I hear a lot is it's sort of this idea that if there is conflict present, then like sin is present. And I will say for sure it can be, but conflict just by itself doesn't necessarily mean that, both parties are sinning or one party is sinning. It really can be what we call task conflict as opposed to relationship conflict, right, or personality-based conflict. Task conflict can really tear organizations apart because you're at a crossroads in terms of strategy, again, or processes or ideas, but it doesn't necessarily mean that, you're out for evil for me or for the organization because you have a different perspective. So I do think that because we value, like I said, unity and togetherness so much, that sometimes we will apply, kind of moral judgments about, or spiritual judgments about conflict. I think that's one way. I don't know, would y'all add anything?
One, maybe even pulling those two parts together, that when I think back to some of the teams I've led over the years, here at Redeemer, some of the ones that were actually the least amount of conflict were the ones we had the least amount of trust, where it's just really interesting that, and I also need to add that I would say just as in general, there's some times where I'm ready for a fight, and I actually really like to debate. So debate is something like that kind of conflict I really enjoy. I enjoy talking through best ideas and what could be. I can live really easily and comfortably in the world of what could be, but sometimes with conflict, though, I think even in my marriage, I think my base inclination sometimes is withdraw and just kind of self-protection a little bit. And so that can play out in my leadership as well at the church. And so sometimes, again, those are some of my own issues. And I think that's actually really insightful, that it may feel wrong, that to talk these things out, and it may feel wrong that there's just a disagreement of some kind. But I think those trust issues have led sometimes to a lack of conflict, and then sometimes my withdrawal, just that it's just such a learned thing from childhood all the way up, that I think it's one way I could deal with it.
You know, I think another thing that just kind of popped into my mind too that is in some ways really unique to a ministry environment is, you know, when you're debating ideas or, you know, you're trying to decide strategy, most of the time, you know, hopefully the parties are all aligned in terms of like the value. Like we want people to know Jesus. We want the gospel to go to the nations. We want to be, you know, a gospel-centered church. And so we're sort of aligned in like the value, but sometimes we're very, very stubborn people and we sort of can make the method a moral thing in our minds, you know, and that's where I think I see a lot of conflict in sort of ministry organizations emerge as we're aligned on what the goal and the vision is, but we're like, this is a hill we're going to die on in terms of, you know, the strategy or the method or the process to get there. Yeah.
David, do you have anything?
Nope.
So piggybacking on the strategies and hills that we die on, what are some of the consistent sources of conflict that we see in leadership teams generally, and then in church leadership teams? And of those sources of conflict, which are the ones that are we see most prone to not engage in healthy ways?
I guess for me, whether it's in a corporate environment or whether it's in the church, I guess for me, most of it seems to revolve around one of maybe two or three categories. One is miscommunication, and usually as a leader, I try to own that, because even if I have to remind myself, even if I think I've said something, if I haven't, as a leader, created enough clarity, that's still in my camp. So I try not to take like any blaming or minimizing or denying into the conversation, but ownership on my part. So that would be one, miscommunication. The bigger one for me would be misalignment in some way, which has a lot to do with expectations. And many of those I find in a conversation are either misunderstood, that's a role that's misunderstood, or there's a lack of clarity. And for me, it helps because from a leadership perspective, most of the times I own that too. And I find that if I take responsibility for my part early, it goes much better. And I'm not saying that doesn't come up to, I'm going to reinforce the expectation, especially with employees and the relationship we have as stewards of the organization, as stakeholders in the organization. But I find that disarms the environment. But I find that even among elder teams, sometimes there's unspoken expectations that we have of each other. And when those aren't met, we bring kind of that baggage of what I thought the expectation was, that when I've made it up in my mind, somehow you haven't met it. I never said it. We never talked about it. We've never talked about it in a group, but I had it and you violated it. Bringing that to a conversation, I find isn't a really healthy way to start. I've tried it that way. It hasn't gone very well. But owning that early on and realizing that, in my view, through the power of the Spirit, realizing that there's a Spirit convicts me of, hey, look, you're bringing in the wrong expectation in the conversation. That's where I see big opportunities for conflict to arise. Expectations, unspoken expectations, for me would be one of the top.
Okay. No.
I would say too, just from kind of thinking organizationally, absolutely expectations, role ambiguity or role, the lack of role clarity is another way that we see a lot of conflict emerge on teams. The one that is sort of my hill to die on, so if you know me, like what I'm the most passionate about, that curiosity about people, is understanding how talent and strength play out in human behavior, right? So we all have these gifts that God has given us. We have these talents, these naturally recurring patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving that can be productively applied, right? And so when I think about the conflicts that I get to help mediate, one of the things I do in my business is I'll get called in when there's sort of like dumpster fires happening relationally, and I don't know what that says about me. Like, I get really excited about that because I just feel so passionate about helping people get to a place of understanding and empathy about one another. But what I have found to be the case is that whether it's task conflict or conflict around ideas or processes or expectations, that when you really, really dig, most of the time you can find a lot of the root, the understanding there has to do with our unique talents and strengths and how they're playing out and how we are perceived. So I think a lack of self-awareness, a lack of self-expression, and a lack of self-regulation around those talents and strengths is another major source of conflict in any organization.
Okay. So let me ask this question. Dusty, I want to start with you on this one. So I went to seminary, and I learned to read Ephesians. While I'm still in seminary, I have zero leadership experience. I get a job leading in a large area in a really large church, and I know nothing about leadership except let's just do it. And along the way, I've learned some really hard lessons and have been hurt a lot and hurt a lot of people. What are some of the things that when you look back on your years in ministry, you just go, man, I wish I knew this then, or biggest regrets when it comes to conflict over the years?
Oh man, that basically all checks out what you just said there. I mean, I bet anyone that's a pastor in this room, you're like, yeah, that's pretty much exactly how it happened. Very few people got into like church work going, you know what? I'm going to lead through change, and I'm going to, you know what I mean? I'm going to navigate skillfully conflict and whatever. I mean, it's like, no, I wanted to come preach the Bible and make disciples and reach people and, plant churches. And like, that's why we got in it. And like, to be just totally honest, while we're sitting here talking, even as I was reflecting a little bit, even like thinking of specific people and some like, I've probably had more conflicts gone really ugly in the last like 5-6 years than in my whole lifetime before. I mean, like used to back when I would pray through the Lord's Prayer, it's like just as a grid of like guiding your prayer of, hallowed be your name is, just like adoration and kind of working through it and give us this daily bread. And then that one part of even, forgiving others who have wronged me, as the Lord forgives me. Like used to, and I'd have to think like, that's like basically the category of enemies. I'd have to think like really hard. It was like, oh yeah, there's that kid on my kids' travel team that relationship kind of soured. But now I've got, I think there's a handful of people that like hate my guts a little bit. And so like it hurts. And like to be straight, like some of these like really ugly conflicts are the thing that make me not want to do it anymore. Like I actually really love the work, but some of these like relationships that have really turned sour and feeling like there's this one-way mirror of expectation emotionally for care and for leadership or whatever, and that I don't meet those expectations, they leave whatever the case is. And so honestly, there's a lot of hurt on my end. And I'm positive, like you just said, I know that I've hurt people. I know that. And that I haven't handled conversations well. Like even in some of those situations that, like I'm not going to talk about them in particular, but I can be like, man, I handled this conversation right here like really poorly. Like that, I did a really poor job here that actually I could kind of understand why they left mad. And so those things are really hard. And so when I reflect on it, that I think the specific question here is like, what advice would you give someone that has gone through that? Like what specifically?
Yeah, what do you wish that you knew then that you know now?
Yeah, that's it. So I think part of it is at a certain level, like expecting it at a certain level, that I remember whenever I planted a church and people would say, hey, your people from your core team, they're going to leave and maybe even leave ugly. And I was like, well, sorry about that for you, but we're like tight though, you know what I mean? And, but man, like at a certain level, like expecting there to be some challenge and suffering along the way. So I think that some of it is just expecting it to be hard. And I think the other thing is that, the one time, I forget who it was. I felt like it might have been like an Andy Stanley podcast, and he was interviewing somebody about conflict. And I may have it somewhat wrong, but he talked about letting yourself into the tiger cage and locking the door behind you and throwing the key out there with like this conflict, and maybe something you've been avoiding, which I've already told you, I can be a little bit avoidant depending on the situation and the person and the kind of conflict, is when you know that there's this elephant in the room and it's this tiger that may devour you. The surest way for it not to devour you is to go face it down and go, all right, can we just talk about this? And there's sometimes where it does go really badly, but I found that just locking yourself in there with a tiger of whatever it is that's going badly, and just saying, can we just talk about this? And I'll tell you this, if I have one reflection on a handful of these relationships that went really poorly, that if I could go back and do some of them again, I think one thing I might have done, especially, and I actually did this a couple of times, I just wish I'd have done it consistently, is when I got to an impasse with someone, to bring in a third party in the church. Because here's the thing, it's not just them that could get reactive, especially if I felt like they were throwing haymakers at me that were unfair. I can show my teeth, and then all of a sudden I'm not ready to withdraw anymore. I'm ready to go. You know what I mean? When I feel like you're unfair, or if you're hurting some of my people, now I'm ready to go. And I wish that when it got to this point of reactivity, I wish I'd have brought in a third party that loved both of us, that could just calm the whole thing down, listen, and I would still be willing to have some of those third party. I probably wouldn't sit down with some of those people one-on-one right now, but I would sit down with any of them with a third party, and I wish I'd have done that then. And I'm not sure exactly if it would have changed how things went, but I think there was a chance to address some of that reactivity in both of us, and then there might have been a way forward, or at the very least, maybe a more amicable separation, even if they needed to move on. And sometimes people need to move on. If they, like Leanne mentioned a moment ago, that sometimes people are trying to recreate their church they grew up in, and they're wanting us to be that better version of this small church, and they already kind of resent the fact that it's big, and whatever the case may be. Or you may be a small church, and they're wanting all of the programs and things of this big church they went to in Dallas, and that they're wanting it to be another theology, another something. So sometimes people need to move on, and that's okay. But I wish that I would have had some ability to slow down, lean into it, expect it, and resolve it in a more purposeful way, I think.
David, anything you would add?
I guess two things. One is, I hate to put you on the spot here, Dusty, but I'm going to anyway. One is a skill that I've seen Dusty exhibit, that I've seen. I think he's just really skilled at it. I don't even know if he knows this, but we serve on two boards together, and one of them, Dusty has this skill of paraphrasing, not just repeating, that's like mimicking, but he actually did it just a minute ago when he came back to your question. And I find that in conflict, I wish I would have understood better that a big part of conflict is listening for meaning and demonstrating that people are heard and that you hear them clearly, not just the emotion, but what they actually are trying to communicate. I think that is really disarming. Then the second thing I would wish is that early on, I think I was really focused on, because I was reading like 30 or 40 books a year at the time, and I thought, man, if I just use this one thing, and some of those were really good. I think all wisdom comes from God and is a gift to us, and knowledge. But I wish I would have understood better that I kind of disconnected the spiritual from like my leadership, and I thought, well, I'm really focused on doing these things, planning for this what could be a difficult conversation, doing my part in it. And where I've had the best outcomes was when I didn't go in there in my flesh, but I went in there walking in the Spirit, and then I found that the Spirit met us there and did things that I could never do on my own. And so making sure that I'm genuinely who I am in Christ in that conversation, whether it's in a corporate setting or in the church.
One more thing too on this, that something that David said there made me think of this. That one other thing is that, all right, so yes to all that, and I was just thinking about some of the conflicts that I've had. So here's the last layer, and I actually mentioned this on our intro the other night when I talked about confidants and allies. Who exactly does a pastor or an elder or a leader in the church talk to when you're in a conflict with another senior leader in the church? Like, how does that play out? And the answer is there's nobody to talk to. Like, you may have like a group of guys that you're really close with that are members of the church. I've got two that have been coming over to my living room for 10 years, and we have coffee every Friday morning. But if I'm in a conflict with a senior leader that is also one of their leaders, I can't say, dude, I want to kill him, and let me tell you how he hurt me, and I don't know if I can get, whatever the case is. And so you end up talking to your spouse about it, and then your spouse ends up becoming this toxic dump zone of all of the nuclear waste in the church. Does any of this sound familiar? And who does she go talk to about that? I get to go to the office the next day and see God do these other positive things. She's hearing all of this toxic waste that's dumped on her. Neither of us have appropriate outlets. And so I think the other thing I wish I would have told my 21-year-old bright-eyed and bushy-tailed self, as I was starting off in ministry was, hey, you're going to need to cultivate some confidants. They are likely outside of the church. They may be in this room of somebody that you can pick up the phone and be like, dude, I don't know what to do. And somebody that isn't in your church, that cares about you, that doesn't have a dog in the hunt there, that just cares about you and can walk you through that. I think having somebody that's a legit confidant, you don't have to filter like who I can talk about what thing and what issue with. It makes a significant difference.
That's good. If I could answer for myself on this question, I would say I'd go back in time and I would know the importance of making people feel heard, in particular when we disagree. And not just be heard, but go the extra mile to feel heard and make them feel heard in our disagreements. That'd be the one that I'd go back 20 years and say, I wish I could have a do-over on that one a few hundred times. So, in our prep call, one of you said this. David, I think it was you. Conflict is not synonymous with leadership, but it's close. You're inviting conflict by creating clarity, giving direction. So one thing a leader does is invite conflict. Can you explain what you meant by that? Leanne's next.
Yeah, I really do think that that's just one of the roles of leadership is, especially in I think it's true in any organization. I really see very few differences for a follower of Christ leading as a CEO versus leading in the church. And we take our identity in Christ wherever we go. And so either context, I think humility in leadership requires that we do the best we can to be open to conflict. And I think that's, Dusty kind of talked about this yesterday in one of the sessions that he started with about preaching. I think it's harder. I find it much harder in the church than it is as a CEO. And that's because I'm not regularly as a CEO repenting publicly. But as a leader in the church, that's one of the things that happens. It comes out even in messages where the application of the message is something that I'm struggling with. So I feel like I'm much more vulnerable to the feedback. And as a result, the conflict feels more weighty to me when it's in the church. May not ought to be that way, but that's just what I find, especially when it's something that feels like it's not like a leadership topic, like what's the order of the service. It's not transactional. It's not even organizational. The conflict is around like my leadership or my preaching or something that is highly internalized and deeply, deeply personal. And so, but despite that, I still feel that the responsibility of leadership is to preach to ourselves that this is not personal. It is still with the aim of creating unity in the body and glorifying God. And so the pride that I bring, the Spirit can remove, but it requires humility and surrender. And so that's what I have to keep reminding myself, whether I'm leading an organization that's outside the church or the church itself.
That's good. Leanna, would you add?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think, leadership invites conflict just by nature. I think that leaders, intentional, engaged leaders, also do the work as much as they can to prevent conflict on their teams and in among the church. And I think one of the ways that we sort of underestimate the origin of conflict is really in that top-down communication, the cadence, the rhythm, the way that we as leaders create clarity and expectations. One of my favorite things to do with clients when they're struggling on their teams with conflict is to sit down and help them create sort of ground rules. Like, hey, what here in our unique culture, how are we going to commit to one another that we will engage in conflict? So when I'm frustrated with you as my leader, here's our processes. Here's what we're going to commit to. And when you agree, when you get the team to agree, when you get your church to agree or whatever it is, you're at least at a place where now you can hold one another accountable to the commitments that you've made about how we're going to engage with one another. So I think leaders that do the work to prevent conflict, it's not a panacea. It's not going to fix everything. Leadership invites conflict, but you can do so much work on the front end in terms of your clarity, your expectations, setting ground rules and norms and rhythms in your organization that you will really save yourself so much, hurt and trauma through the process. I think another thing too that I would add to that is leaders who are really good at preventing conflict, in my experience, are those that do the work of actually knowing their people, knowing the people that they're leading. And I don't mean, just, what your spouse does for a living. And I mean, really, truly knowing, hey, what makes them feel threatened? Because anger is often that kind of first emotion that we see, in conflict. But oftentimes when you dig, it's fear, it's a perceived threat. It's feeling abandoned or insecure or overlooked or feeling untrusted or betrayed or whatever it is. So really taking the time to know your people well can help you prevent, because you're doing good audience analysis work. So I would add that too. Leadership invites conflict, but really intentional leaders are going to prevent it as much as they can. Yeah.
So there's a real dance there as leaders that by nature of what we do, we invite and must engage conflict, and we strive to prevent conflict. That sounds difficult.
It is. I remember when I was really young, somebody told me, probably, a little cynical, was like, leading is bleeding, And the other one I heard was sometimes, and this just always stuck with me, it's so simple, but like in a church context, they said, yeah, like sometimes like the sheep are just mean. They're just mean, and you have to kind of do that dance. And that's, I think, the weightiness of leadership.
Okay. So we have 20 minutes. I want to ask one more question. This is to Leanne before we start getting hopefully really practical. You used a few terms in our call that I had to Google while we were on Zoom to figure out what you were talking
That's
about.
bad audience analysis on my part.
Well, you just overestimated my education level. So, you said you talked about guarding against projecting your strengths onto someone else. When you explained what you meant by that, I felt like you were talking to me. Can you explain it? What does it mean? How does it apply to leadership in particular inside the church?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember like the specific context of that, but in general, and I kind of touched on this earlier, that I think leaders and really just anybody, when you bring sort of self-awareness to the table and conflict, you're already miles ahead. You're miles ahead, because what if you're a self-aware person is, and by the way, we're way less self-aware than we think we are, all of us. The research shows that. I was sharing yesterday I led a session, and I was sharing that what the research shows is you climb the leadership ranks, you actually become less self-aware over time. So statistically, in an organization, the person at the very top of the hierarchy is the least self-aware, statistically. Not always. But, so, yeah.
Is that because...
Everybody's like, yeah.
I mean, is there...
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't mean
Yeah.
to cut, but I want to jump.
Yeah.
Is there a correlation to becoming more isolated as well? Okay.
So typically, and what I shared yesterday is what we know is, think about if you're, let's say, an entry-level, staff member or a resident or, an intern or something, you're getting a lot of downward communication. You're getting a lot of feedback. You're getting typically, a lot of coaching. you're hearing about how, how you handled that presentation or that pitch or whatever. You're getting a lot of feedback. And then as you climb, you get less and less feedback just due to the nature of sort of the structure, right? But in addition to that, as you climb and you gain more power and status that hopefully you're leveraging for the good of your people and to, right, the glory of God. But as you grow, people are going to tell you the truth less and less and less about what it is like to work with you, right? And how they experience you. So the reason we know this is when researchers go in and look at organizations and they'll do self-assessment on leaders, like how good of a communicator are you? How strategic, of a thinker are you? How self-aware are you? And leaders will rank themselves, self-assessment. And then when they compare those self-assessments to the objective, third-party assessments of people who report to them or work with them, right? There's a much larger gap between executive level leaders than there is like frontline managers, middle level directors, or frontline employees, right? So all that to say, that's kind of a side note. I'm trying to remember where I was going with all that. But when you're not self-aware, when you don't bring self-awareness to the table in your conflict, what we tend to do is operate from our own biases. And so we have, as I said before, these natural patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving that we bring to the table that we assume everybody else is sort of operating from that perspective. I have a story I tell about my oldest son, Isaac. So he's very strategic thinker. He's, on his best days, he's got vision and he's gonna, accomplish these great things. And on my worst days, he can be like, his worst days, he can be like super manipulative because he knows how to like maneuver and, jockey and things like that. So it was so funny. One day he was sick and he was home and he got a text from Ben. Ben's in the room. So Ben texted him because Ben loves him and says, hey, how are you feeling this morning? And I work from home, so I was sitting there with Isaac. He was on the couch, and I was on my computer, and he looked at this text message, and he goes, I wonder why he sent that. And it just cracked me up because I thought to him, like, it's so, he sees it as like, I wonder where he was going with this. Like, what's he gonna do next, So that's an example of like projecting a strategic thinking, strength onto somebody else. I'm like, no, he loves you. He sent the text because he loves you, not because he had some, like, he was going to ask you to take out the trash next if you said you were fine, or something like that. So that's projecting our strengths on other people. I was just working with a group of leaders the other day, and there are 2 executive leaders, and I'm coaching both of them at the moment, and which is, again, fun for me. I don't know. It's weird, but it's a lot of fun. And both of them have very, very different strengths. And what's fascinating for me is to listen to them assume and project what they're naturally good at onto the other person as almost as though it's a weapon that person is using against them, right? So projecting our strengths is something we do all the time if we don't have good self-awareness.
We are all feeling very anxious right now. Ross will be here in a minute, y'all. Okay, 15 minutes. Let's use some or all that time being really practical. So here's what we all know. Conflict is universal. In homes, marriages, children, church small groups, elders, staffs, conflict is unavoidable. What are some really practical steps that we can give people to engage conflict in a healthy way?
I'll take the first shot at it. I think one is just, this doesn't always happen, but especially when you know that stakes are high in a conversation, like you could call them anticipated difficult conversations, which is a good number. I mean, there are times when you end up in conflict and you just don't see it coming. But when it's planned, which is, I would say, for me, it's a lot. You can anticipate that there's this relationship is icy, or there's, you don't even know what the issue is, but there seems to be like relational friction or distance. Even those, one real practical thing is preparation. So for me, preparation is a couple things. One is praying, trying to make sure that I'm going into it spiritually in as healthy of a spot as I can be with humility. Pride is just, it is something that can derail conflict quickly. So having experienced that, done that incorrectly myself. That's where I'm going to start. And then trying to think through whether, because my tendency with my behavioral style, if I'm not careful, is more dominant. So my tendency is to tell rather than ask. And so it really helps me, one, to think through how I can take responsibility for my part, which is, especially if there's relational damage, that's disarming. Listening better is disarming. And at least initially in the conversation, asking more than telling is really important. So my preparation going into it, along with prayer, makes a big impact. So those are the kind of the practical steps that I take going into it, and praying that, it's a bold prayer to pray that God, through His Spirit, would lead us into greater relational peace as an outcome of the conversation. And when that happens, that is just like, it leads you in praise. And I've seen God do that over and over again. But for me, a big part of that is preparation before, or to the extent my mind is clear, it's actually asking for God's help when the conflict doesn't allow me time to prepare. Awareness to while I'm trying to listen and talk to the Father through the power of the Spirit at the same time, saying, God, help me, I can't do this on my own. If I do, this may not end well or may not go well. So for me, that's what it is.
DT?
Yeah, so I think this is actually a real area of growth for me in the last year. And while I do think I've got some natural strength on this, and that you can maybe help me know which one of my strengths is in play here in a second, Leanne, but I do think I can synthesize things. So I do think that's a thing that comes naturally to me. Could take Keller and kind of break it down, to consult, to like dove hunters, that in West Texas, no matter what Ross says about us, that we're happy about it. And so I do think I have a natural inclination along those lines to take ideas and take things and restate. But I tell you honestly though, like sometimes I don't always use that in interpersonal situations, and I've been a lot more mindful, and it's interesting you noticed it from the board meetings and stuff like that. But there was a guy, me and Ben, it's Leanne's husband, that's one of our executive pastors, our other executive pastor, Keenan Harris. We went up to Amarillo to a former church member's house, and he was going to help us process some vision stuff we're working on. And the first thing he did, and I was a little annoyed by it, is he did communication 101 the whole morning. And I was like, dude, help us process what we're thinking here. But really what a lot of it boiled down is being super clear that what you're saying is what's being heard. And something I do all the time now, there are very few situations I don't do it, whether it's pastoral counseling with a church member that's going through a hard time, or in a board situation, whether it's Redeemer's Elders or some of the boards that David and I sit on, or any kind of leadership conversation or Redeemer Network or whatever, is that let's say somebody else is talking, is to take a stab on, they're asking a question about staffing or hiring or who knows what, and all the way, all right, let me tell you what I'm hearing. And take a shot at restating what you're hearing. And it could be a pastoral counseling situation. Okay, what I'm hearing is that you're really frustrated because he's not listening to you, and there's sometimes you wonder if they're married, you're afraid that the marriage isn't going to make it, and so on and so forth. Restate it. And it's really interesting how a lot of times you haven't heard it correctly, that there'll be a lot of people that are like, okay, close, but I think you're hearing this, but I need to turn that up. You stated it like a volume of 2. I need to take that one little phrase you said and turn it up to 10. I'm really feeling that part. I'm really thinking about leaving or something like that. I think you think that I'm kind of wondering, I've talked to an attorney kind of thing. But it's interesting. You just end up getting clarity, and it's amazing how much conflict either preventatively can be avoided. And there was one time I had a pastor friend of mine that was calling for advice on something, and I thought I saw where he was going. It's almost like the pass was in midair, and I intercepted it and was running back and high stepping into the end zone. I did give him a 10-minute explanation, and he was like, "Thanks for that, but that's actually not what I was asking about." I wasn't even answering the right question, and I'm really prone to that. And so I think getting clarity, but it's interesting also is that as a pastor leader, that you're also the one that is doing a lot of sharing and talking, and you may be. For us, we're casting vision we want to reach 1% of the city of Lubbock in a Redeemer service through a multi-site strategy. That's where we're going. And it's about reach. We want to make deep disciples and just expand our reach in the city. And it's interesting, Keenan said, hey, I'm starting to do that as we sit down with our people one-on-one. And the first question I'm saying is, hey, what did you hear from that meeting? It's an incredible question because some people may say, all I hear is y'all want our money. Now, we haven't heard that, but they could. Or all I heard is y'all just want more people. Or who knows, they might hear that a lot of different ways. And you're like, okay, hang on. But it's really interesting to ask that question. What did you just hear? And when we initially started talking through with our elders about this, the first thing we said is like we put our statement up on the board that we processed in Amarillo, and we went around the room and had every elder go around and say, okay, what did you hear from this? And it's just really interesting. We're like, okay, actually that's close, but can I clarify this one thing? And so I think that would be, on a very practical level, something you can use in any pastoral counseling situation, people you lead and manage outside of the church, inside of the church. You may be a youth guy of your pastor that supervises you, is just get clarity. Okay, I hear you saying you want more youth. What does that mean? What does that mean? Can you tell me like how you imagine that happening, or what would be a win? What kind of youth? Whatever. Is that like one event, like regularly at Wednesdays? Just getting more clarity all the time, I think, is something that would be one of the things that's the most helpful thought for me recently. It's avoiding it and even leaning into like moving towards conflict that needs to happen.
Okay. So, Leanne, before you go, let me synthesize and restate what y'all have said.
Let's go.
That was funnier, I thought, by the way.
Yeah, that's great. We're learning right up here, man. This is
are.
happening. Yeah.
So far we've said pray, prepare, and then synthesize and restate for the sake of clarity.
Yeah, I think that's a good restatement.
Okay, thanks, man.
What I've heard, what I was trying to communicate. Yeah, I could have said it shorter, but I'm a preacher. So I'm going to illustrate it and, all that. I want you to feel it.
Leanne, what would you add?
Yeah, first off, Dusty, when you were saying, we were going through Communication 101 and you're like, it kind of annoyed me. It cracks me up because, so in my former, life, I was a communication professor. I actually do still teach one class for randomly Missouri State University. But one thing I used to always tell my students was, because they would say things like, this is like common sense stuff. And I used to say, well, it may be common sense, but it's not common practice, right? And I think that's exactly what you're speaking to is, there's a reason why employers say that the number one skill they're looking for in employees is communication skills. It's because it's hard. Communication is hard. And so I love that. I absolutely agree. I would say, doing really good audience analysis work in your preparation is something it's a hill I'm going to die on. Really taking the time to assess, can I articulate their argument? Can I articulate their position in a way that they would agree with? And I think that's why I can't listen. I kind of do sometimes, but it drives me crazy. Watch like a debate, like a political debate, because I'm like, nobody is attempting to actually characterize the argument from the other side in a way that they would say, that's what I believe. That's my conviction, right? So getting to a place where in your audience analysis, you can do really good work like that is a big one. The other thing I would add is, this is just communication 101, is in those tough conversations to actually have a moment at the beginning where you sort of express where the goalpost is. Like, what is the specific goal of this conversation? What do we hope to accomplish together? And then also to share just kind of relational affirmation. Those are very, very practical things that research shows make a very big difference in the defensiveness, the defensiveness level of both parties in the conversation, and also physiologically. Research shows that when you have those kind of relational, affirmation moments, those goal clarification moments at the beginning of conversations, blood pressure actually goes down. And that's always a good thing when you're in a conversation. So I'd say practically state where the goalpost is, give some relational affirmation, and then listen really well. Yeah.
Okay, so pray, prepare, synthesize, restate, and be clear about what the objective is. Okay. With our last few minutes, I want to ask two last questions. First to Leanne, and then the second one to you two guys. On Monday night, Dusty opened the conference and he said, we know there's a variety of people in the room, wives, teams, lay elders, staff members, that we hope that you feel seen in the conference, and we really do hope that in the way that we've organized and laid out in the structure of the conference that everyone in this room felt seen and valued, because you are seen and you are valued in the Redeemer Network and by our Redeemer churches. But I want to ask this last question to y'all directed to lead pastors in the room. because we do believe that healthy churches are led by healthy leaders who are leading healthy teams. In our conversation, you said that your team, speaking of lead pastors, that your team is losing trust in you when conflict is left unengaged. Can you maybe explain and apply that to our lead pastors in the room?
Yeah, I think, again, there's a lot to unpack there, but what I will say is when your team or when your congregation senses the elephant in the room, they sense the tension, they sense that there's not alignment, right? There's conflict, that every sort of day that you, as an executive level leader, sort of ignore that, what the research shows is the rest of your team begins to lose trust in your leadership, right? It's sort of, I think I used the example in the call of when I was a professor and I taught, face-to-face classes, there's always like that one student that is like will not stop talking and is just still, and everybody else in the class at first is annoyed at the student, and then after about the third time, they're not annoyed at the student anymore, they're annoyed at you, at the professor for not like handling it. It's kind of the same way. So there's this concept called organizational justice. And a lot of times with conflict among team members, especially, like if I'm working with David and he's like a toxic person, which he is of course not, but if he was, and there's conflict on our team and it's causing drama, and Dusty, my boss and elder, is like doing nada about it, over time, my resentment and frustration towards Dusty is as equal to, if not greater than, my feelings towards David. So that's something really important to keep in mind. Yeah.
Okay, that's good. So let me close with this question to the two of you guys. In this room, a number of lead pastors. If they're in here and they're listening to this panel on conflict resolution, and they know that there has been unaddressed conflict for 6 months, a year, it's needed to be addressed, and it's long overdue. Maybe it's with staff, maybe it's with elders, maybe leaders, maybe with a couple of core team members that are really in an unhealthy way toxic to the rest of the core team. But it's just been sitting dormant. When they get back, what's step one?
I'll take a shot at this, and then Dusty, you'll brilliantly close. So I guess one would be take courage that you're not alone. You're not going in it alone. The Spirit will be with you. The second one is, if this is an area that you struggle, I remember the first person that I had to fire as a CEO, it was before I was a CEO, was in a kind of a mid-level job. They thought they got promoted. That's pretty bad. So that didn't go very well. And so one of the things I learned is that, man, there's people that are much better at this than I am. And so I actually started role-playing with people. I wanted to be a really good leader. And man, that was injustice to that employee. So I just committed, hey, I'm going to get better at this, and this is hard work, and I'm going to start role-playing about how I lead these difficult conversations better. So I would take heart in that. And then finally, one of the greatest blessings actually comes from Jesus' own words in Matthew 5, where he said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." And that reminds me that being a peacemaker is actually part of my identity in Christ. And so that gave me enough courage to walk in it, saying, look, the Spirit's going to empower me to do this. So it just gave me great confidence. So I just want to encourage you as you move forward. You're going to mess it up sometimes. You're not going to get it perfect, but it's an area through the power of God where we can all grow and mature. And so that's what I would say is kind of the first steps. Just push past the discomfort and realize that there's many resources, most importantly, the Spirit in the midst of it.
Amen. DT?
I would, a couple things on this. One, I went through a 2-year program with a guy named Elliot Grudem that's called Leaders Collective, kind of helped to train the thing that Leanne talks a lot about, sense of self-awareness and whatnot, and like these kind of soft skills of leadership and pastoral ministry. And one of the things he pushed me the most on is he said, I bet you see things all the time that you see clearly in your people, but you don't tell them. Like, hey, here's this thing right here that if you were to do, you would like really kill it and grow. And to a certain level, that's true. And so something I'm really trying to be better at is just giving like regular feedback. Don't withhold feedback for performance reviews or, an annual thing, but just give regular feedback, good and bad. Hey, that was really great there. And hey, I noticed the way you talked to that woman in the hallway, and I don't know if you knew like your body language, whatever, but like give them like real-time feedback as much as you can give regular feedback, and that you're actually really serving them well in that. And I think that's one of the things like where there's a conflict that I don't know, like kicking the can down the road, or even worse, preachers are really bad about this, is leaving that kind of communication to Sunday morning from the pulpit, or a staff-wide meeting where you're like, there's some people out there that don't work very hard in this church, and whatever, and you're like talking about your youth guy or something like that. Not this youth guy here we got, but maybe your youth guy. I don't know. But something on that, just you can save your breath on. Not only is it cowardly, but one thing I've learned over the years is the people that probably need to hear that never hear it. If you think a broad blast, a shotgun blast of like some kind of correction is going to be heard by the person, that the lazy youth guy is going, yeah, I know there's some people out there that don't work very hard, it's crazy, the lack of self-awareness that some will have. And so you're just much better having a loving but clear conversation where you clearly communicate what you need. And this is also where I'd say that's the first thing, is as much as you can give regular, honest feedback. The second thing I would add on this is something that Ben and Keenan have really added. I think Ben, through a lot of Leanne stuff that he's fully adopted with employee engagement and everything like this, is I would even say that formal processes are your friend, and having different ways to even measure engagement of employees, staff, volunteers, and like regular built-in processes of evaluation. And that while you don't want to delay feedback to these regular intervals, but having something where you can look to that's quantifiable, to be able to like measure and have direct conversations about progress of growth areas, and just where people always know where they are. And like we're hopefully if there is an employee that's struggling, that they know that they're struggling, that wouldn't be news to them, that there's been a review, and if it progressed, it'd go to a performance improvement plan. And I know that if you're like me, that's something you may be allergic to, but between regular feedback and even some built-in processes could be your friend in all of this. And so I would advocate those. And Leanne, or if you want to come grab, Ben or Keenan, these guys are really strong at this, and they could be a real resource to even for your church size and structure, building some things that make sense for you.
That's great. Can we thank them for serving us this morning?